Games are amazing. In addition to being fun, they teach us how to engage with the world through play. They've also been used to train some of the greatest military minds. But in the 19th century, a Prussian father and son brought strategic gaming to a whole new level with profound results. Join me today on Footnoting History as we learn more about their game. Welcome to Footnoting History. I'm Sam, and I will be your host today. As always, if you want to learn more about our podcast, including how you can keep us going, please check out our website, www.footnotinghistory.com. Today, I get to talk about games, or one game in particular, but it's an important one, Kriegsspiel. In many ways, this game was rooted in the military ethos that was hardwired into the Prussian aristocracy. Our first protagonist, a minor baron named Georg Leopold von Reisswitz, was the son of a military captain who had served in Frederick the Great's army during the War of Austrian Succession before settling in the newly conquered Silesia. While Reisswitz planned to follow in his father's footsteps, an injury on his left arm made that impossible, so he pursued a career as a military strategist instead. As a student, Reisswitz enjoyed playing games, but he couldn't afford the decorative sets of his youth, so he used painted blocks instead, and by 1785 he had developed his own kind of simple war game. After that, he worked for a few years in the local government, but he lost his civic post in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, which left him with time to really focus on the game that he had devised and now played with his teenage son. Sometime around 1810, Reisswitz decided he wasn't satisfied by the traditional grid-based gameplay that was common to military games like chess. Instead, he began to mold three-dimensional landscapes out of wet sand to simulate more accurate troop movement. Once he had a working model, Reisswitz traveled to Berlin to try to popularize his new game, and by 1811 he was invited to demonstrate his new game to the Prussian princes at Berlin Castle. The princes, who had recently lost their beloved mother Louise, liked what they saw and invited the inventor back to demonstrate his new game for their father. Embarrassed to come before the Prussian ruler with a table of sand, Reisswitz spent close to a year developing a higher quality model. What he developed was a square table roughly 6 feet wide that could be fitted with movable terrain pieces made of painted plaster representing roads, villages, swamps, and rivers. The set came equipped with porcelain pieces and a rulebook bearing the title Taktisches Kriegsspiel, or Tactical War Game. All of the pieces could be stored in drawers in a convenient cabinet that was set under the tabletop. The improved version, though much too expensive for mass production, was both realistic and customizable, though it did not have a mechanic to account for large differences in elevation. Unlike conventional games, pieces did not move by the square, but rather by the distance, which could be measured using rulers that were conveniently included with the set. The royal family enjoyed the game and continued to play it even as the Napoleonic Wars progressed. And in the winter of 1817, on a visit to Moscow, Prince Wilhelm showed the game to his cousin Grand Duke Nicholas, who would soon become Tsar Nicholas I of Russia. Nicholas would also later receive a demonstration of the fully realized game. But in the meantime, Reisswitz kept playtesting his game and produced a more elaborated version in 1816. In the meantime, Reisswitz's son, Georg Heinrich Rudolf Johann von Reisswitz, had enlisted in the Prussian army to fight the French. He had advanced quickly through the military ranks, especially after earning his Iron Cross in 1813. After Napoleon's defeat, the younger Reisswitz, who was apparently a talented violinist among other things, joined the Guard Artillery Brigade of Berlin, and by 1816 the younger Reisswitz had taken over development of his father's game. He added more pragmatic military experience to the game and enhanced its realism. He also shortened its name to Kriegsspiel, or War Game. The younger Reisswitz, who unlike his father had real-world battle experience, sought to create a realistic picture of combat. Instead of using expensive and elaborate imagined landscapes, he used maps of real battlefields that had been scaled down so that 1 inch of the board represented 400 paces. The maps selected were the ones produced for the Prussian General Staff in the 1820s by the cartographer Johann Georg Lehmann. These maps were familiar to military men of the day. They were extremely accurate, and in addition to taking into account all of the physical features that had been present in the original game, they included differences in elevation which could then be factored into strategic calculations. The updated game also took time into account, allowing for troops to move only as far in each turn as a real soldier could march in 2 minutes. which meant that the infantry could only move about 200 paces or half an inch. The pieces, now painted red and blue, were also scaled to match the size and footprint of standard infantry, cavalry, and artillery blocks. The new game rendered total victory almost impossible. When the pieces faced each other, they would take points worth of damage rather than wiping each other out entirely, which is again a fairly accurate reflection of real combat. The younger Reisswitz also introduced umpires and dice to his game. Effectively now, there would be 3 players, or more often 3 teams of players. These players were the 2 opponents and an umpire who was charged with creating natural scenarios. The 2 sides, moreover, would not necessarily be equal at the start of the game, as indeed opponents are not always evenly matched, and the objectives, which were determined by the umpire, would not necessarily be consistent from one game to the next, nor did they always entail total victory. In order to play the game, the players had to transmit their orders to the umpire in writing, and the umpire was empowered to interpret these directions as they saw fit. Unclear instructions could be misunderstood, and the player might not even know that things had gone awry. This game mechanic really drove home the necessity of devising specific and accurate instructions on the real field of battle. Moreover, while the umpire had a bird's eye view, he only placed pieces on the game board if both sides were aware of them. Therefore, it was possible for troops to be lying unseen in wait for an opponent's misstep, or indeed, for troops to be out of position without the commander's knowledge. So we can see that the umpire, which was frequently Reisswitz himself, played a critical role. The dice were also essential because they added an element of chance. Now, to be fair here, Reisswitz was not the first person to use dice in a wargame. They had also been incorporated into a chess-like game developed by Johann in the late 18th century that the elder Reisswitz had played in his youth. Dice were not, however, employed in the first iteration of Kriegsspiel. Unlike his father, the younger Reisswitz had been in combat, and he understood, and here I quote him, that the results of artillery fire can differ considerably even when circumstances are the same, end quote. The rolling of dice was a way to replicate this element of uncertainty that a field commander would experience in real life. Much like in modern games, like Dungeons & Dragons, the players could add or subtract to the value of their roll depending on factors that would either advantage or disadvantage their troops. So, if the artillery was firing from an elevated position, they would have an advantage. But if their enemy was concealed or partially concealed, they might have a disadvantage. Thus, while the use of dice ensured that there was some unpredictability, they were not totally random. Players could use probability. If you're playing a game with 2 6-sided dice, for instance, you know that you're much more likely to roll a 7 than, say, a 2 or a 12. Players of Kriegsspiel could make similar calculations, especially since probability had been a mathematical discipline for roughly 2 centuries before the advent of Kriegsspiel, but that's a topic for a whole separate episode. It suffices for now to recall that Reisswitz would have expected that his players could make basic calculations based on probability. The incorporation of dice was not the only way that Reisswitz used math. In fact, he put a lot of thought into military statistics and used them to help improve the accuracy of gameplay. He wasn't by any stretch the first person to try to apply mathematics to warfare or to realize that mathematics could enhance military strategy. In fact, the younger Reisswitz relied heavily on Gerhard von Schonhardt's 1813 book that quantified the performance of guns on the battlefield to determine outcomes in his game. He also used data from historical battles to help create realistic outcomes. The system Reisswitz devised was extremely complicated. It involved the use of 5 6-sided dice. It would be simplified in later wargames, but the principle that the use of statistics and dice rolls could improve the accuracy of gameplay was transformative and has since become standard, though games now typically have conventional dice with corresponding tables to give outcomes, whilst the original Kriegsspiel dice had specific outcomes inscribed on them in tiny writing. This was possibly a way to help distance the game from any association with gambling. In 1824, Prince Wilhelm, who was by then the commander of the 2nd Guard Division and the 3rd Army Corps, rediscovered the game he had played in his childhood. At his request, the younger Reisswitz demonstrated the new and improved version of Kriegsspiel at Berlin Castle in 1824. The demonstration took weeks to complete, and during this time the palace cats were banished lest they overturn a piece. The prince was so impressed that he invited Reisswitz to demonstrate his game to the highest levels of the military command as a training tool. Following the demonstration, the chief Prussian general, Karl Freiherr von Muffling, was so enthusiastic about the game that he had it distributed throughout the military and gameplay became compulsory for certain officers. Thereafter, the game maker had to organize a workshop to mass-produce the game. The game was repackaged into a box that was 10 inches long and 6 inches wide, which rendered it both more portable and more affordable than the old version. In recognition of his game-making achievement, the king elevated Reisswitz to the Order of St. John, making him the first member of the artillery branch to receive this honor. And soon, there were Kriegsspiel clubs formed within the Prussian military. One of the earlier adopters was none other than the legendary Prussian tactician Helmut von Muchte, who we'll come back to soon. But while there were some enthusiastic adopters, others worried about possible misuse of the game, and still others found it simply too fussy and annoying to play. The inventor, it turns out, was not the best advocate for his game. Reisswitz rubbed people the wrong way, often making hostile remarks. Moreover, encouraged perhaps by the warm royal reception he had received, Reisswitz did not refrain from criticizing men above his station. At one point, he even chose to recreate the Battle of Lützen, with one of the commanders effectively being forced to replay a past defeat. As you can imagine, there were some high-ranking officers who resented the fact that they had to defer to their subordinates' judgment when he served as umpire in these mandated games. So when Reisswitz was promoted to the rank of captain in 1826, he found himself effectively banished to a distant outpost at Torgau. This new assignment, it seems, crushed his spirits, and on September 1st, 1827, the younger Reisswitz killed himself. His father died a year later. In the wake of this tragedy, Kriegsspiel was distanced from its inventor and from the dishonor of suicide. A new edition was released by the Berliner Kriegsspielverein, or the Berlin Wargame Association, in 1828, and it had no mention of the name Reisswitz. The BKV's PR campaign worked, and people kept playing Kriegsspiel as a training tool. By 1873, when a magazine ran a feature on Kriegsspiel, it claimed that it was a traditional war game amongst the officer corps of the artillery, and suggested that its rules did not appear in print until 1846. This claim was simply untrue, and it was corrected by an anonymous letter to the editor, which many historians have suggested may have been written by Kaiser Wilhelm I, who had, after all, played Kriegsspiel throughout his childhood, having been introduced to it by both of the Reisswitzes. The truth is that even after the tragic demise of its inventor, Kriegsspiel remained a central part of the training for the German artillery officers. Its use of chance was recognized as an indispensable tool to help military leadership learn how to deal with the unexpected. Moreover, although it went through numerous rule changes and had to be updated as new weapons and technologies were introduced, it remained a standard part of the German military education for half a century. It was not, however, kept as a trade secret, and editions also appeared in Dutch and in Russian and later in additional European languages, though it didn't actually gain much of a following outside of Germany until the 1870s. Even at the time, many believed that Kriegsspiel was responsible for honing the skills of the Prussian military leadership, and have concluded that it may have allowed for their remarkable victories when fighting Denmark in 1864, Austria in 1866, and France in 1871. It was no coincidence, perhaps, that the military genius behind all of these astounding victories, von Muchte, was not just a Kriegsspiel enthusiast, but also the leader of the Kriegsspiel Club in Magdeburg. After these victories, Kriegsspiel became something of a fad worldwide. But there were many who felt that there were too many rules to make it really applicable in World War situations. One way to compensate for this flaw was to allow the umpire to have more discretion in directing gameplay. Others, particularly in Britain, adapted the concept of war games to create more popular entertainment rather than using them exclusively as training exercises for professional military men. For example, H.G. Wells created a commercial war game horrifically titled Little Wars, a game for boys from 12 years of age to 150, and for that more intelligent sort of girl who likes boys' games and books. Well done, Wells. Well done. Wells, as many of you may know, was a staunch pacifist, and his game was intended to invoke such horror in its players that it would prevent all future wars. But that didn't really work as planned. In the end, one of the most famous Little Wars enthusiasts was none other than Winston Churchill, who was not exactly opposed to warfare. But I'm getting ahead of myself now. At the end of the 19th century, the Germans were still using Kriegsspiel to train officers, to keep their skills sharp, and even to inform promotion decisions. But they were no longer the only nations doing this work. Kriegsspiel and other war simulations had become so popular that by the time he retired in 1888, von Muchte cautioned the German government that other nations were nearly as well trained as the German staff. He suggested that Germany should avoid future military entanglements because they would not have such easy victories as they had had in the 1860s and 1870s. It turns out he was right, because their next major entanglement would be World War I, and we all know how that turned out for the Germans. There are historians who have insinuated that Kriegsspiel might even have played a role in the overly aggressive stance taken by Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1914. Like his grandfather, Wilhelm II enjoyed playing Kriegsspiel. But unlike von Muchte, who ensured that teams were balanced, at least in terms of military expertise, the ruler tended to attract the most experienced men to his team, and he always won. There's been some speculation that these easy victories may have encouraged the Kaiser's fantasy that he was a military genius, which may in turn have made him less cautious about entering into the First World War than he might have been otherwise. This hypothesis, however, cannot be confirmed. Kriegsspiel was also influential in planning the early phases of World War I. It helped the army, now under the leadership of another von Muchte, the nephew of the previous one, to organize their ammunitions and fueling operations. It was also responsible for the much-famed Schlieffen Plan and for the deviations from it. There were, however, some flaws to Kriegsspiel, and they really showed here, because while the game could help military leaders gauge how much fuel and ammunition they needed, it could not assess social or political repercussions, which in this case included the British entry into the war. Over time, Kriegsspiel had to be adapted to account for new technologies, but new editions continued to be played even after World War I. Though temporarily hobbled by the Treaty of Versailles, the Germans were able to use Kriegsspiel to help plan the Blitzkrieg strategy that worked so effectively in 1939. Nazi wargames also correctly predicted that the Battle of Britain would end in a draw. Kriegsspiel was also played with some success by one of Stalin's generals, Georg Zhukov, and is said to have played a role in causing that dictator to ramp up recruitment in Russia, which ultimately may have forestalled a Nazi victory, so Kriegsspiel is being used by both sides here. Militaries and security agencies around the world still use war games for training purposes. Kriegsspiel was not the first or the last game of its kind, but its emphasis on realism, its incorporation of the role of chance, and its insistence on removing the grid from gameplay were all game changers. I've never played Kriegsspiel, but now I kind of want to. Or maybe I don't, if it's really as finicky as its detractors say. In any case, I'm glad that it inspired a plethora of civilian wargames that we still play, ranging from Stratego to Risk to Settlers of Catan and of course to D&D. That's it for me today. But I hope that if you've enjoyed this episode, you'll listen to more stories in the Footnoting History archives or learn more about our podcast at www.footnotinghistory.com. Until next time, remember, the best stories are always in the footnotes.